Revelation 2453. From the 21st of August 1942. Revelations of God through creation and directly. Just as the divine creative will is revealed in nature, God's Spirit is also revealed in the people whom His creative will has brought into being. What came into being out of Him and out of His power is only perfect if it is aware of its outcome, if it knows about the creating power and its perfection. It must, as it were, feel its power in itself, and it must know about the origin of this power and about its effect. Therefore, the gift of knowledge must be given to the being which has emerged from God. It must be able to imagine something which corresponds to truth, and these ideas must be made accessible to it. This ability is possessed by the created being in its human stage. It can think, act, want and feel. It can recognize and thus also become perfect if it uses its abilities correctly, and by using them correctly it can perceive God's revelations to itself. It can be enlightened by His Spirit so that it receives all knowledge and the human being then becomes knowledgeable. God reveals Himself to people through His Spirit. It is the profundity of love which moves Him not to be grasped by the human being, for he lacks every measure for the greatness of creation, for the countless living beings which animate the great creation. And so he also lacks the understanding for the insignificance of the individual being, measured against the infinite creation. But nothing in this infinite creation is too small, too insignificant for eternal love to be grasped by it. Every being is governed by divine will, looked after by His love and permeated by His strength, and God reveals Himself to every being if it wants to receive His revelations in a certain state of maturity. But not always in the same way. However, He speaks to all people through creation. He let everything come into being around the human being and gave him the gift of thinking, the intellect. Thus the language of creation can very well be understood by every human being, and God can be recognized in it by all people. And if the human being uses the gift of thought correctly, that is if he uses the knowledge gained through creation as the basis of his intellectual thinking and strives for further knowledge in his feeling of belonging to the power which gave rise to creation, if he consciously unites himself with this power in his desire to expand his knowledge, then he unconsciously fulfills the conditions which are required for further revelations of the creative power. The desire for truth is only felt by a person in a certain state of maturity, and therefore this desire is also met in the way most understandable to the human being. The direct revelations of the Divine Spirit require special conditions and are mostly connected with a task to fellow human beings. Although these revelations obviously testify to divine activity, they are nevertheless offered in such a form that they can also be rejected by the human being who does not desire truth, for the acceptance of divine revelations requires his willingness. For this reason creation as such will not force people to recognize a powerful and mighty deity, but only the human being who wants to recognize feels God's language in creation. For the countless miracles of creation need not make an impression if he ignores them or only regards them as necessary for human life. God can therefore never reveal himself to him, for if he were to do so in an obvious way without the human being applying for it himself through his way of life and his desire for truth, then freedom of faith would also be called into question, which is by no means in God's will. Spiritual development in particular has to be striven for completely freely of its own accord, but spiritual development is absolutely guaranteed if the human being makes himself worthy of God's revelations, for these are His words spoken in love to people which He sends to people. Through this word He informs them of everything that is useful for the human being to know. And what He now presents to them makes it clearly recognizable again how infinitely great and kind the eternal deity is, how it is only ever concerned about the well-being of what has emerged from it and what God's activity in the universe consists of. And as soon as the human being is aware of this, he consciously strives towards the eternal deity and desires the influx of strength which flows from God to every being and is felt by the human being. He strives towards perfection in order to be able to unite with the strength which caused everything that exists to come into being out of greater than great love. Amen.